Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. Are you managing vulnerabilities or are they managing you? With SANS faculty fellow and industry recognized security expert, Dr. Eric Cole. You're also joined by Beyond Trust product manager, Alex DaCosta, who will run us through a Beyond Trust overview and demo towards the end of the webinar, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. I'd like to remind you to please submit your questions via the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we will cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 2 business days from now. So at this point, let's hand it on over to Eric. We'll jump right in. Eric, welcome to the line, and please take it away.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today. I figured in my typical style of starting webinars, let's start off with a provocative statement. If I could be honest with you, one of the things I cannot stand, one of the things that drives me crazy, one of the things that I think is the biggest waste of money on the planet is vulnerability scanning programs. Now that I have your attention, let me explain. Organizations spend all this time and all this energy scanning and scanning and scanning and scanning. And I can't tell you, I've sat in these meetings that happen twice a month, and they'll sit there and go through all the vulnerability scanning information, and they'll talk about the number of vulnerabilities for Windows and Unix and Linux and all these different OSs. And you might have been in those shoes. And the problem I have is usually about halfway through those meetings, I'll raise my hand and I'll ask, how many vulnerabilities have you remediated in the last 30 days? And they're sort of silent and go, oh, Eric, we haven't got there yet. Then what's the point of scanning? I want you to have a vulnerability remediation program, not a vulnerability scanning. Now, I know you could say it's a play on words because you can't do remediation if you haven't done the scanning. But what I'm doing is I'm shifting and changing the metrics. Tracking metrics on vulnerability is futile at best because not only do vulnerabilities always change, but I don't care about random vulnerabilities. I don't want you to go in and fix 500 random vulnerabilities. I want you to fix 5 vulnerabilities in which there's a real threat with a high likelihood. We want you to focus on the remediation of the most critical vulnerabilities that's going to make it more difficult and harder for the adversary to be able to break in. So first question, do you have vulnerability remediation metrics, and are you focused on fixing the high priority problems within your organization? Because one of the things we have to recognize, and if you have not had this discussion with your board of directors, you need to. You are going to be compromised. If you are not seeing signs of compromise, it's not that it's not happening. It's that you're looking in the wrong spot. I'm actually finishing up some travel, and I was at a conference giving a keynote, and I had a little time after my keynote before this webinar started. So I decided to sit in on the next session, which was a panel discussion. So as they started the panel, each panelist went in and introduced themselves. And the first panelist got up, he looks at the audience and goes, we have not had a breach for the last 2 years. And he starts pumping his fist, and you can see the audience, yeah, yeah, yeah. And they start cheering, and he's putting his hands up like this hero, and everyone's sort of applauding and cheering at this guy. And then the next panelist gets up, and they sort of put their head down. They sort of don't make a lot of eye contact, and they go, we've had 3 attacks in the last year. And you almost hear silence. You might hear 1 or 2 people, ooh, ooh, ooh. It's sort of a little embarrassed. And I'm watching this play out. And if I could just be honest with you, this is about the most galactically stupidest thing I have ever seen. The person who said they have not had any attacks or breaches in the last 2 years should be fired for malpractice. And the person who went in and said, we've had breaches, they're a hero. They should be cheered. You are going to be attacked. You need to go in and understand how the adversary is going to compromise your organization and focus in on fixing those vulnerabilities. The reason why organizations spend millions upon millions of dollars and they still get compromised is because they're not focused on fixing the right problem. You can put a lot of security, but if you don't understand what systems are visible from the internet, you don't recognize what ports are available, and you don't understand vulnerabilities in the service, you're not going to be able to protect your organization. We need to go in and make things more straightforward. If I'm staying in a hotel and you want to rob my room, you want to rob and steal my stuff, what do you need? You need three things. You need to know the address of the hotel I'm staying at. You need to know the room that I'm staying in. And you need to have a way to get into my room. There has to be some vulnerability, whether you take the key from me, whether you socially engineer or trick one of the cleaning folks, whether you find a vulnerability or fault in the system, but you would need to find some weakness or vulnerability in order to get into my room. So if I wanted to keep my room safe, I would need to identify what the vulnerabilities are that would have the biggest impact based on that threat, and I would have to fix or address those vulnerabilities. And that same logic goes in cyber. I know there's lots of books, lots of courses, lots of things written on hacking, but if we really take hacking a server and we break it down into its fundamental components, it's really just three things: visible IPs, open ports, and vulnerabilities in the service. You can't hack what you can't see. So you want to go in and make sure you have metrics on what systems are visible from the internet. What systems could an adversary potentially get you from the internet? You then want to go in and close and limit any unnecessary ports, reduce vulnerabilities with patching and get rid of outdated software, and then ultimately make sure there's no sensitive data located on those systems. If there is, you fix those vulnerabilities because those are the biggest exposure points that could cause the most harm and the most damage. Now, I'm sure we've all gone in and seen our risk formula and threats and vulnerabilities, but vulnerabilities are essentially weaknesses that allow an adversary to get in, which means we only want to focus in on vulnerabilities in which there's a high likelihood threat, and that vulnerability will cause a big impact to our critical data. What is the difference between a major breach and a minor breach? Just think about that for a moment. What's the difference? What's the difference if there was a breach right now that you would sit there and say, oh, you know something? I'm going to deal with it tomorrow. I'm busy now. I'll deal with it tomorrow. Versus a breach where if it happened right now, you would basically call your family and say, I'm not going to be home for 5 days, and you're going to be living at work. I'll tell you the difference. The difference is the data that was compromised. If somebody breaks in and they access the system that does not have any critical information and is not connected to any critical data, that's a minor breach. If somebody breaks in and accesses critical information or critical data that can cause huge monetary loss or reputational damage, that's a major breach. So really the difference between major and minor breaches is the criticality of the data. So therefore, you want to go in and you want to fix the vulnerabilities in which there's a threat that can get to your critical data. The way I always describe security is, if you look on my right hand, we have the evil actors. we have the evil actors and the threats. And then in my left hand, you have your critical data. And there is basically a road that those threats are going to take to get to those critical assets, known as the roads of vulnerability. So you have to figure out what are those most common roads or vulnerabilities, block, stop, or remediate them. Those are the vulnerabilities you want to focus in on. We want to get out of this game where people go in with vulnerabilities and they play the quantity game. You might have done this where you go in and say, oh, we need to fix 50 vulnerabilities a week. Or I hear some people sometimes say, let's fix the low-hanging fruit. Let's just fix the easiest vulnerabilities first so we can go in and show that we've addressed 100 or 200 vulnerabilities. Now, that approach doesn't work because the number of vulnerabilities is infinite and vulnerabilities are dynamic. If your vulnerabilities were finite and static, then that approach works because any vulnerabilities you fix reduces the size of the surface space and eventually you would have everything fixed. But if your vulnerabilities are infinite and dynamic, then any time you spend fixing a vulnerability that doesn't have a high likelihood threat and a huge impact to the organization is wasted time, wasted energy, and wasted resources. So you want to make sure you're focusing in on the vulnerabilities that really matter the most. And when we look at vulnerabilities, they're created through many methods. They're created through coding and development of software that's so complex that there's extraneous components. It can be done through configuration, default installs, where extra services and extra ports are related. It can also be because somebody goes in and updates or makes changes to a system and doesn't realize the extra components or the extra exposures that they create. Now, if we're going to look at vulnerabilities, we need to step back and look at the big picture. The big picture is, whether we like it or not, everything we do in security is all about risk management. Security is all about understanding, managing, and mitigating the risks to our critical assets. That's what we're doing. Now, the cool part is every one of you are masters of risk mitigation. The reason I know that every one of you are masters of risk mitigation is because you're on this call and you're alive. Your life, the survival of your life, is because you have managed risks. There are risks in your everyday life that you have been able to mitigate and you have been able to manage to this point in order to survive. So now all we have to do is take that knowledge and expertise that's in your subconscious, that has been ingrained since you were small, of deciding and managing risk, and get you to apply that in cybersecurity. Same analysis, where you go in and you focus on two things: threats and vulnerabilities. Threats are the potential for harm. Threats are the things that the offense can do to cause harm or damage. Vulnerabilities are those weaknesses in our defense that allows the threat to go in and cause damage to our critical assets. Now, question: if you have a threat and you have a vulnerability, you have a high risk. If I want to reduce the risk, I just have to reduce one of those two items. Because it's multiplication, I only have to reduce one, and then the product will be reduced. Which of these two out of threats and vulnerabilities do you control? Vulnerabilities. You don't control threats. You can't go in and control foreign adversaries. You can't go in and control organized crime or the weather. The only thing you control is the vulnerabilities. So the problem is people jumpstart and they focus in on just scanning, trying to find all the vulnerabilities that are out there. Now, you must do some scanning in order to remediate, but the focus of your effort and the focus of your metrics must be on the remediation, not the scanning. I don't want to see data on how many systems you've scanned. I want to see data on how many systems you remediated. So that's problem one. The second issue is because the vulnerability is what you control to reduce the risk, everybody wants to jump in and just start fixing random vulnerabilities. Let's just start fix. And as I said before, I've seen strategies where let's just pick 40 a day or pick the low-hanging fruit or pick the easiest ones first. And that doesn't work because our vulnerabilities are always changing. So this is why you have companies that spend all this money on finding all these vulnerabilities, fixing random ones, and they still get compromised because they didn't focus in and understand their environment. They didn't go in and do what they should and understand the criticality of their data, which means when we go in and we focus on risk, the first thing we always do is let threat drive the risk calculation. We're always going to go in and look at our threats first. Then, once we understand what are the threats, then we look at which vulnerabilities would impact our data. Now, I'll let you in on a secret. The secret sauce that makes this risk cake taste so delicious is likelihood and impact. We want to focus in on the threats that have the highest likelihood and the vulnerabilities that have the biggest impact to causing harm. So let me show you how you can go in and very quickly get insight into where you need to focus within your organization. So here's the exercise. Take a piece of paper and break it into 3 columns. Now the trick is, in order for this to work, you only get one piece of paper. Where organizations start failing is when they try to get too much information. So if you try doing this on 30 or 40 pages of paper, you're going to have way too much information. You need to prioritize. You need to go in and focus on what are the 5 or 6 most critical items in each column. So one piece of paper. Here's the first thing. The first column. What are the 5 or 6 most critical assets or business processes to your organization? So you can do this for a business unit. I was just working with a large company, and we were working with each business unit to go in and do the analysis. So a business unit would do this. I've done this with executives. So it's whatever level you want, but whatever you're in control of. So it can be the entire company or individual business units, but what are those critical assets? What is the information that if it got compromised would be a really bad day? It would be a major, major incident if it happened. That's what you want to focus on. What are those top of the line critical assets, those most critical business processes? Then once you understand that, then each column builds on the previous. So the next column, what are the threats that have the highest likelihood of causing harm to those critical assets? So now what are those top threats that are out there? And then finally, what are the vulnerabilities that would allow those threats to have the biggest impact to your critical assets? So notice, we start with our critical assets. We then hone it down by looking at what the top threats are. And then and only then do we map it to those key vulnerabilities. Now, once you're done with this exercise, essentially what is in that right-hand column are your most critical vulnerabilities and issues that need to be fixed. Essentially, that's your security roadmap. So now you have the moment of truth. If you do this exercise and that right-hand column aligns with your security roadmap, congratulations. Your security roadmap is properly aligned with risk. However, if you get done with this exercise and that right-hand column does not align and does not map with your security roadmap, warning, 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 there might be a breach in your future. Now, let me explain. I did a research study earlier this year where I was given 10 companies that suffered major breaches and 10 companies that are properly securing and properly protecting their enterprise. And the research question I was given is, what's the difference? What's the difference between companies that are winning and companies that are losing? Now, I'll be honest with you. When I first took this project, I'm like, easy peasy, right? Piece of cake. This is going to just be so obvious when I do this. So I started going through and I started realizing, wait a second, companies that are winning and companies that are losing are spending around the same amount of money. Companies that are winning and companies that are losing have about the same number of resources. Companies that are winning and companies that are losing typically have the same security components, firewalls, IDSs, IPSs, SIEM. So as we're going through this and doing the analysis, I'm sort of getting a little more frustrated and a little more concerned because I'm going, there's got to be a difference, but we haven't seen it. And then here's the moment of truth. I then found my 3 golden questions. And those 3 golden questions are, for any time you're going to spend an hour of your time or $1 of your budget on anything in the name of security, you always ask, what is the risk? Is this the highest priority risk? And is your solution the most cost-effective way of reducing it? And I went into the companies that were losing and I took items in which they spent money and I asked them, what risk are you focusing on here? And they go, I don't know. I'm like, then why did you buy this? Well, that's what a vendor recommended, or that's what we did at a previous company. Well, is this the highest priority risk? Well, I don't know. We didn't calculate. And what I realized is when I went to the companies that are winning, when I asked these questions, they could answer them for every single item. So companies that are aligning their security roadmap with risk are the ones that are winning at protecting their assets because they're focusing on the highest priority areas. Organizations that are not, that are just randomly doing things, are the ones that are getting breached and the ones that are getting compromised. So this chart is one way of going in and making sure that your security roadmap is derived from a risk calculation, or if your security roadmap is already developed and you don't want to rework it, you can then go in and ask those 3 questions for every item. For every dollar you're spending, identify what the risk is, verify that it's the highest priority risk, and determine that your solution is the most cost-effective way of reducing it. Now, I don't want to make things too complicated, but this chart is great for getting initial visibility. This chart is great for getting visibility into what those top vulnerabilities are. Now, you might already know that, but you want to prioritize what are the kingpin or critical vulnerabilities. So what we do is we actually mix this chart up. So we're going to move this and do something called threat mapping. So imagine if threats is in the first column, vulnerabilities is in your second column, and your critical assets are in your third column. And now what you do is you simulate attacks. You take each threat and you connect it to the vulnerabilities that are needed in order to exploit your critical assets. And if you do this for 7, 8, or 9 different threats, you will start seeing some of the vulnerabilities that are used over and over and over again. And those are your kingpin or highest priority vulnerabilities. Because one of the issues is most companies look at vulnerabilities individually. This vulnerability is a high, this is a low, this is a medium. Problem is most adversaries use multiple vulnerabilities to break into a critical asset. So if we go in and map how the threat works and look at that correlation of vulnerabilities, we'll start to see the ones that are most critical and most impactful. So some of my favorite vulnerability metrics are on the remediation side. honestly, with most of my clients, I'm not as concerned about what you're scanning and how often you're scanning. What I want to know for the last day, for the last week, for the last month are the number of critical vulnerabilities that were remediated for your key assets that had high likelihood threats. Then I want to know the number of critical vulnerabilities for those key assets that have not been remediated for 30 days. And then finally, I want to know the number of critical vulnerabilities that have been remediated but are now open again, have now been reopened for some reason. That's what I want to focus on. If you can focus in on those three metrics, you're now starting to control the vulnerabilities. You're not letting vulnerabilities chase you around. You're focusing on the ones that you need to focus on that have the highest potential impact to your business. And the thing that we all know, but I always like putting in there for completeness, is we are always going to have vulnerabilities. There is always going to be risks. And I was giving a lecture today, and somebody asked, can 100% security exist? Can we actually achieve 100% security? So my initial response was no. You can never have 100% security. And then I caught myself going, that's not true. Let's look at my iPhone that I'm using for this webinar. If I want to make this iPhone 100% secure, what can I do? Turn it off, rip out the battery. For those that are more destructive, smash it with a hammer, right? You could do those things, and then you could argue that that iPhone is probably pretty close to 100% secure. What's the problem? It has no functionality. It has no value. It has no usefulness. So if we want to have any usefulness or value to our organization, then we have to allow functionality. And as soon as we allow functionality, security drops below 100%. Imagine a sliding scale where we have security on one side and functionality on the other. If we're at the top where we have 100% security, that would be 0% functionality. And if we go all the way to the bottom, we have 0% security and 100% functionality. So our goal is, where can we find that balance where we have just the functionality we need and nothing additional, so we're maximizing our overall security. And as I mentioned a little earlier, what you always want to remember is, what is the difference between a major breach and a minor breach? It's all about your critical data. So do you know where your data is, who has access, and who should be accessing it? When I was growing up in the 70s, we didn't have cell phones, computers, or any of the crazy stuff we got today. I sometimes feel like my dad when I do that, and I have to go, and we used to walk to school in the snow, uphill, barefoot, right? Those whole stories. But I remember, because we didn't have cell phones, they would do these commercials where you would be watching TV in the evening, and they would come on TV. It is 9 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? And the idea is to raise awareness, because many people didn't know where their children were, so it just helped raise some general awareness. I think they should still do those commercials, but they should now say, it is 9 o'clock. Do you know where your critical data is? Because that's really the question, is, what is your most critical data? Where is it located? Now, here's the problem. Most people can go in and they can tell me that their critical data is located on these 4 servers. And you know something? They're correct. It is on those 4 servers. But it's also on 3 additional servers they don't know about. Now, if your data is on 7 servers and you think it's only on 4, where are you going to spend all your energy and effort? On the 4 servers where you believe it is. If you're an adversary and you want to steal the data, what are you going to go after? The 3 that they're not aware of. So getting part of this correct doesn't work. You have to find all of it. And then you need to know who's accessing it, who is really accessing it, who should be accessing it, and then what business process do we need in place in order to protect that. Now, I want to be a little careful with this slide, and I'll be honest with you, I debated back and forth whether to include it, because honestly, it frustrates me so much, and I think it's a disservice when you have these folks that go in and they'll take a piece of software in isolation, configure it in a certain way, and then go in and bypass or break it, and then they'll make the claim. Firewalls are dead. Antivirus is dead. IDS is dead because they were able to go in and configure it in a way that they can find the vulnerability. And it always frustrates me because I'm like, wait a second. No technology was ever meant to protect against everything. So of course, any protection mechanism, if you throw attacks that it wasn't designed for, or you misconfigure it, of course it's going to miss attacks. So I feel like when you go in and you start criticizing these under a microscope, it really doesn't do a lot of service. But what I'm going to try to do here is just make it aware that a firewall was never designed to prevent all attacks. It was never designed to protect. A firewall was meant to control the flow of information, to control the flow of data, and it does a great job of limiting what IPs and what ports. But do you realize that most companies that get compromised have firewalls? They have IDSs, they have IPSs, and they still get hacked because they're not focused on the foundational items. The foundational items of security are asset inventory, configuration management. You need to know what servers are on your network and how they're configured and set up from a vulnerability perspective. The way a lot of adversaries break into companies that have spent a lot of money is they'll find a system that's visible from the internet that has vulnerabilities and potentially has access to sensitive or critical information. So you always want to go in and understand what are those assets, and remember our rules of network architecture. Any systems that are visible from the internet must always go on the DMZ, and DMZ systems never contain sensitive information. Any system that has sensitive information always goes on your private network and is never directly accessible from the internet. So one great little exercise is look at any system that is visible from the internet, look at every system that contains critical data, and no system should be on both lists. You should never have you should never have a server that's both visible from the internet and contains critical data. So we're also going in and segmenting and reducing that overall exposure. So we want to make sure that we're always going in and doing that network monitoring. We want to have the vulnerability assessment, the logging. Now, I'll give you a warning here. We have done what often is done is you go from one extreme to another. So for a while, many companies didn't have any logging. They didn't have any scanning. They didn't have a lot of security. Now, today, the problem is that companies it's not that they're not logging or they're not scanning. It's that they're logging too much and scanning too much. How many of you on this call get so many logs, your team would need to be 20 times the size in order to process all those logs? Or your vulnerability scan reports are 3,000 pages. Right? The problem today is not that we don't have it, we have too much of it. We haven't properly prioritized. We haven't focused in on what's most critical. So what you want to do to better manage your vulnerabilities is to go in and prioritize those. Don't focus on the low priority stuff. Don't focus on anything in which there's not a high likelihood threat. Do that exercise I did earlier. What are your critical assets? What are the threats with the highest likelihood? And what are the vulnerabilities that will have the biggest impact on your system? So when we go in and look at our remediation process, we always want to prioritize. Then we want to make sure that we're properly keeping our software up to date with patching. We want to make sure we understand how the systems are interconnected. We want to constantly monitor our environment, constantly detect and look for new ways of breaking in, constantly perform analysis, get rid of any unnecessary services. Remember, the best way to secure a service is not to patch it, it's to uninstall and remove it. It's to actually get it off the system. And then you want to go in and make sure you build out a proper security roadmap. So I'll give you those actual steps. First thing is make sure you have an awareness program. Make sure you have policies and people understand, because remember, the two targets that an adversary is going to go after are a server and a person. If you look at the behavioral patterns of how an adversary breaks into an organization, they are going to target an asset that has information. That asset's going to be either a computer or a person. Since this was really focused on system vulnerabilities, I really focused my portion on the system part, but we know the accidental insider or the insider threat is also a big target area. Then we want to make sure that any of our security is also properly aligned with any mandates, any regulations, any compliance. We then want to make sure that we have the support of the executives, we have proper buy-in, and we're constantly prioritizing. We want to make sure anything that we can do can be sustained long-term. And then we finally want to make sure we have proper metrics to continue to measure what we're doing. So now that we have a better idea of how we can do some of this analysis by doing our mini risk assessment, by doing our threat mapping, and by looking at vulnerabilities, now I'd like to go in and turn it over to Beyond Trust, where they can go in and show you some of the actual tools and methods for doing this. So I would now like to hand it over to Alex, better known as Lady Gaga.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. So let me go through a bit of what Beyond Trust can do, as we can do quite a bit from the vulnerability side of the house, but we also have some solutions in the privilege account management side that can actually tie in to some of the items that Eric was talking about regarding access and who's actually accessing some of those critical systems. But let's talk about Retina, and time permitting, I'm actually going to show you a few reports as well. But Eric makes some great points, which is, yeah, people are out there and just scanning and scanning and scanning and really not doing anything with that data. It's almost like they just check the box. Yeah, I'm doing vulnerability scanning, or that's my vulnerability management program, but that doesn't really solve any problems, right? So from our Retina side of the house, our enterprise vulnerability solution is meant to be able to assess and discover anything that's connected to the network, right? You got to know what's in that network, what's running in that network, what ports are open, what services are behind those ports, and then obviously be able to decipher what vulnerabilities are there, and we're going to help you prioritize what to fix, and then help you measure that success over time. Eric also mentioned that you need to know what's available or visible from the outside, from the internet. So we've got our web security scanners that's hosted on the outside to be able to scan your perimeter for those web apps and kind of really go in there and crawl them and see what vulnerabilities are there. But even just for a very simple, here's the IP space that I own publicly, let's have our solution go out there on a recurring basis and see what's out there, make sure that it matches with what you're keeping track of. That's kind of from the Retina side. From the Power Broker side, again, that's our list privilege side of the house. And some key items here that actually tie into the Retina solution is, one, a password safe solution or a password management solution that allows you to, have the solution manage the credentials for those critical systems, right? So we're automatically rotating those passwords, doing the basics of what you would expect a password management solution to do, but then doing some key items, delegation, who has access to those credentials. Let's log who checked out credentials to what systems and delegate those permissions, of course. Record that session. What did the person do on those critical systems when they logged in? Be able to keep a track record of that. And of course, as soon as they're done, let's reset that credential so they can't do something malicious at a later time, for example. When that is happening, we tie in vulnerability management to that. This is all really the same management console. It's our Beyond Insight IT risk management platform that these solutions sort of plug into. So from a credential perspective, we're able to see what vulnerabilities a system has. Redna has told me that information. So before I give somebody access to that system, I might want to hold off on that because I've realized that Redna is telling me that that system is quite vulnerable. So I might not want to delegate somebody to have access to it just yet, for example. So that's kind of a tie-in that we have there from a password management and vulnerability side. Then the next one has to do with what somebody can do in an actual system. Once I'm on that system, I want to run as least privileged, right? I don't want to be an admin on that system. I can really get myself in trouble. So I want to have just be a standard user, which then obviously means that certain applications might not function. I might not actually be able to do my job because some things, in fact, do require privilege. So this is where that least privilege solution, Power Broker for Windows, for Unix, for Linux, for Mac comes into play. Based on rules, I can elevate those privileges and allow that user to do its job. Again, I can log, I can do session recording, etc., based on certain actions. And I can also tie in vulnerability to that. I can see what applications the user is executing on those endpoints and whether or not they're vulnerable. This really helps in the prioritization. As Eric mentioned, people just get a big long list. It's not uncommon to see a 3,000-page vulnerability report. Unfortunately, that is true. And people just are hammering away, right? Oh, looks like we have a vulnerability on every system. If I just fix that, it looked like I really did a lot because I remediated something across every system, but you probably wasted your time. Knowing what applications are vulnerable is good, but knowing where they're actually being executed and used is even more important. It helps you prioritize. Say Adobe, for example, it's vulnerable. Maybe it's part of your standard image. Everybody in the enterprise has got Adobe Reader. But maybe only the HR department is heavily using Adobe Reader and nobody else ever clicks on it. So I want to focus my efforts in remediating Adobe Reader in the HR department first, because that's the biggest threat, if you will. Somebody's likely to get a malicious PDF file. It's going to be the HR department. They're the ones who are going to open it. They're the ones who are going to get compromised, and now we're in. So helping you prioritize your vulnerabilities based on who's actually executing those applications is something that we can help you do. And even block them, block the application from running because of its vulnerability. So lots of things that we can do. Again, this is all tying together into one single platform. That is our Beyond Insight IT risk management platform. So let me bring that up here just to give you a little preview of that. So what I've done is from a time perspective, I've jumped in directly into this section, which is our Smart Rule Manager. This is the ability for us to do a lot of things within the product, create groups, and then take actions on those groups. But one of the key things I wanted to show you guys is how you can train the product to understand the criticality among the different groups. This is something that Eric also brought up, right? So you have to know which are your critical systems. And humans can do that. Humans know that I've got a database server here and it's got credit card information or it's got personal information. I know that that's a critical system. To a computer, scanning other computers, they're just other computers. Yeah, I can say that there's a SQL server there. It doesn't mean that it's critical. So we can take this interaction and basically say, I've got an address group. I can do lots of different queries by operating system, by services that are running, lots of criteria. But bottom line, keeping it simple, I've got a group of systems which I've deemed my demo lab. It could be your DMC. It could be those critical web servers, database servers. What am I going to do with that? The actions below. I'm going to define these 5 criteria that are based on CVSS environmental metrics that will tell the product how to adjust those CVSS scores according to those systems. So if I have the same vulnerability on my desktop, that is also happens to be a vulnerability on that critical server, I should obviously not prioritize my machine first, but a standard vulnerability report will simply say, I've got a critical vulnerability on machine 1 and machine 2. This helps the product help you prioritize better. And with that, I'll jump over here to our reporting side of the house, where I want to show you a couple of those reports. So we'll start with a heat map. So we'll go into the risk side of things, and I can do a risk matrix by assets or risk matrix by vulnerabilities. The idea here is really the same, is to give you a very simple to understand heat map where the top right quadrant are my most critical vulnerabilities or my most critical systems. And in parentheses is what is exploitable out of those vulnerabilities that are there. So giving you additional context to prioritize by. On the left-hand side, you'll notice I have lots of filters. I can filter by smart group. So I would choose my critical systems there. We create a smart group that contains those critical systems. So I'm filtering farther. I can filter by whether they're exploitable, have exploit toolkits, the age of the vulnerabilities. Are they 0 days? Bottom line, I'll end up with this heat map where I can see that I've got 12 critical exploitable vulnerabilities. I can go into that 12 and I can actually see what those vulnerabilities are, CVSS score, PCI ratings. Yes, these are all exploitable, and how many systems are actually impacted. And of course, I could go into those systems, go into that number and see what the systems are. So a very, very easy way to prioritize and not just get that really famous 3,000-page vulnerability report that really means nothing. And one last one here I'll do is on trending. So again, Eric pointed out, you got to understand what's happening. Are you fixing vulnerabilities? What is sort of your remediation program, and is that working? So I'll just show you one here that we'll just narrow down to high and medium risk. So we have lots of Delta reports, lots of trending reports. I'm just going to jump over to the graphical representation here. But the solution is going to tell you over time, how many vulnerabilities do you have month after month? What's the average age that they're open for? And what is that fixed time over time? Again, on the left-hand side, narrow down to a particular smart group, right? How is the DMC doing? Or how are web servers doing? How is the database doing? How are we remediating vulnerabilities there over time? And lots of ways we can show you that numerically, as well as graphically. We have Delta reports. We have SLA reports, so you can actually state, I've got 2 days to fix high-risk vulnerabilities on these groups. I've got 7 days if they're medium. I've got 14 days if they're low. And then do an SLA report and actually see over time, are you meeting those your own set compliances for remediation, so you can understand what changes you need to make. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I think I'll show you that one last report from an SLA perspective, and then I'll wrap it up here. So we'll do an SLA report. Let's go back in time here a bit. Let's go back to February. I don't do much remediation in this particular lab, so I've got to set my SLAs a bit higher so I'm not just in the red. But you'll notice that I can set the days to which I can allow myself to remediate something depending on its severity. So it's very user-defined. You also have the ability, obviously, to select smart groups, so you can tailor it to just those particular smart groups. And I'm also going to toggle this include fix equals yes. I'll explain what that means here in a second. But the idea is simple. For a particular group of systems, whether it's a business unit, again, databases, whatever it might be, you will assign what the SLA is for how long you have to remediate vulnerabilities in that environment based on severity. And I will be able to see month after month if I'm in the green or the red. I gave you the disclaimer already. Very little gets fixed here, so very little is green. But I can see by those severities how much is actually being fixed within that allowed time that I gave myself, and what's in the red, right? I'm doing very bad. And I can also see the lighter green, which is SLA met. It was fixed versus things that were still open sort of past that time, or things that were fixed but not within the SLA. So you can get a little more granular if you wanted to for those things. I've actually seen companies use these SLA reports sort of to incentivize different teams to kind of get their act together, right? They'll kind of publish these and say, you know, the team handling these servers, here's how their, you know, SLAs are doing. Here's another team handling other patching of other environments. Here's how their SLAs are doing, and sort of incentivizing them to kind of get on top of it. So lots and lots of report options that we have here. Again, from the, you know, the very common, here's 3,000 pages, good luck with that report, to, as you've seen, heat maps, as well as threat analyzers, and many other reports to kind of help you understand what's critical, help you prioritize, and do some risk forecasting as well, where I could take an environment and say, if I were to remediate the top X number of vulnerabilities in that environment, how would it change? How would my security risk change? Again, based on defining those groups that are critical, let's tackle them. Let's see how that environment would change. What are the vulnerabilities that I need to tackle that would have the biggest impact? So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Sarah, which I believe you've got a quick poll.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, I do. So let's go ahead, jump into our last poll here. Would you be interested in engaging with one of our security experts further? We would love to chat with you or walk you through a more thorough one-on-one demo of either Retina, our vulnerability management solution, or one of our privileged access management solutions. So let us know, and if you select yes, somebody will be in contact with you. I know Alex showed a bunch of reports and functionality of Retina, but if you'd like to dive in a little bit deeper, this would be a great opportunity for you to select yes, and somebody will reach out to you to get that squared away and scheduled. So I'm going to leave this up. Let's dive into just a couple of questions here, and then I'll wrap it up. Eric, this is for you. So what is a way to get better visibility into the vulnerabilities that need to be remediated?
The real trick there is that actually goes back to the threat mapping exercise that I mentioned to you, because very often vulnerability scanners give a good starting point where they will show you high vulnerabilities. But as I mentioned, most adversaries often utilize multiple vulnerabilities together. So by going in and mapping out how a threat would break in and show the correlation of vulnerabilities, you do this 8 or 9 times with different threats, and all of a sudden, it's an amazing thing. All of a sudden, you will start to see those critical kingpin vulnerabilities start getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden, you very quickly can identify these are the core areas we need to focus in on. And then most important advice is always make sure the vulnerability is a root cause problem and not a symptom of a problem. For example, I see a lot of clients spend a lot of time fixing vulnerabilities that require patching, updating, or fixing a service. Well, you could probably have 300 or 400 vulnerabilities on patching, but what's the root cause problem? The root cause problem is you don't have centralized patch management. So is it better to spend 100 hours fixing individual patches that will just continue to create problems, or should you spend 100 hours on fixing the root cause problem by installing patch management and making sure that that problem is fixed long term?
Okay, let me close this poll down. And one more question for you, Eric. So is the output of high, medium, or low from a scanner conclusive enough to make a decision, or is further analysis required?
Unless you are in a very specialized environment, further analysis is required, and this is why. Vulnerability scanners are great. They're a wonderful way to get data points of where there could be high, medium, or critical exposure points. But remember, it is based on conditions of the environment. If we have a server that is on an air-gapped network that's isolated from every other network and is physically secure in a vault, even if a vulnerability scanner comes back and says that's a high, because somebody being able to get to it is very low, that would actually be a much lower vulnerability. And also, we can have cases where a vulnerability says it's low, but if it's on a system visible from the internet, that has critical data, that might be more of an exposure. So you always want to make sure you're stepping back and taking into play the environmental conditions, compensating controls, and what the critical data is.
Makes sense. All right, guys, let's go ahead and wrap it up here. I would like to remind you, I did receive a couple of questions about the recording and the slides. First off, the slides are available in the handout section right now, but even if you don't have time to download them from GoToWebinar right now, we will be sending you a follow-up email with a link to the recording and to the slides shown here today, and it will come from our email alias communications@beyondtrust.com. So make sure you have us whitelisted so you receive the follow-up. A huge thanks to Eric and Alex and to all who attended live today. Thank you guys so much for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day and your week, and we will see you at the next one. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.